It made noise. Okay. I really want to take a moment to sort of express appreciation again from Alice and myself for that beautiful Founders Day that you provided for us a couple of weeks ago, which I sort of see as a celebration of the community that we're building here for ourselves and for the wider community as best we can. And I was going to talk about Camus in a couple of reasons. One was because I think he really articulates the vision that we share. And I think we can draw from and benefit from Camus and his writings and the struggles that he dealt with and the issues he tried to confront and how he tried to do that. And I was scheduled to give this talk, and then I was invited by Wiley Blackwell to contribute the section on Camus to their new Encyclopedia of Ethics. So it seemed to me that it was an appropriate confluence of events. As most of you know, I have written a couple of books on Camus. I don't know. No, it's okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And I brought the books back there for anybody who wanted to peruse them. One is Camus: A Critical Examination, which is a theoretical overview of all of his work. And the other is Sartre and Camus: An Historic Confrontation, and it really is a commentary, translation and commentary of the confrontation between Sartre and Camus that was sort of a cause célèbre of certainly of the European French intellectual community and the United States also. I think it was on the front page of Life magazine or something when it broke out in mid-1952. I thought I would try to give sort of a preliminary introduction. It can't go into great detail, but it can give a sense of what it is about Camus' thought and writing in his life, which was such significance, and which is perhaps of such relevance. So I want to begin with the citation from the Nobel Prize Committee as to when they gave him the Nobel Prize in 1957. He was the second youngest person ever to receive the Nobel Prize. Rudyard Kipling beat him by a couple of months. And the Nobel Prize Committee said the following: he was honored for his important literary production, which, with clear-sighted earnestness, illuminates the problems of the human conscience in our times. I think that does, to some extent, capture part of the relevance of Camus for ourselves here today. That vision, I go on, and this is really from the beginning of the preface of the book I wrote on Camus, I go on to say the following: Camus has been at the center of the passionate controversies that have rocked the modern world, from existential anxiety in the face of the death of God, and the absurdity of human existence, through practical struggles around capital punishment, social injustice, and national liberation, to growing concerns about torture and systematic violations of human rights. And this was that part written by me well before the Bush era. That vision, gives you a sense, and I come a little further just to give a framework for the thought of Camus. This reflection gains increased urgency in an era in which world wars and mass genocide threaten to be surpassed by nuclear annihilation, a capacity that few now doubt is within our collective power. Addressing our civilization at its metaphysical and mythical roots, and I want to draw a little bit about what I mean by that, Camus seeks to diagnose those interior forces seemingly propelling us toward destruction, to explore their inner logic in order to suggest the preconditions of and the practical steps required for a cultural rebirth. In a world without transcendent significance, and this, of course, really addresses that notion of the absurd for which he is well known, and I'll say something a little bit about that. In a world without transcendent significance in which we are all condemned to death, what, he asks, are the possibilities for an honest and clear-sighted coming to terms with our condition? Can we not find a way to celebrate our life on this earth in dignity and self-respect? And what are the paths that lead in that direction? And that really is the challenge of his life and his work, to which I'll try to make some comment and go a little further. But to give a full sense of that, I'll conclude this sort of introductory notes with the quote from Sartre, who was his one-time friend and then his profound adversary for the last 8 years of Camus' life, who wrote in his obituary about Camus, he said, "Camus' obstinate humanism," relevant to us, I think, here, "narrow and pure, austere and sensual, waged an uncertain war against the massive and formless events of the time. But on the other hand, through his dogged rejections, he reaffirmed, at the heart of our epoch, against the Machiavellians and against the idol of realism, the existence of the moral issue. In a way, he was that resolute affirmation. Anyone who read or reflected encountered the human values he held in his fist. He questioned the political act." So it gives you a sense of that, of what he was about. I want to say something about the person himself, a little bit about his work, about his activities, and then speak a little bit about the work that he wrote. He came to public consciousness in a sort of flared international way at the end of World War II. Received the Nobel Prize in 1957 at the age of 46, and then died, as one knows, tragically in an automobile accident on the 4th of January in 1960. To get a sense, though, of his early years, I brought my little stuff here. Here is just a little bit about who this person was. A French Algerian from a poor working-class district of Algiers. All right? His initial experiences were quite pedestrian. Coming from a family where his father had died in the First World War when he was 1 year old, his mother worked as a cleaning woman. Books had no function in his home. Children were expected to earn their keep before they could read. His earliest years were spent among multi-ethnic poor. Before I go further, let me just quote from. I brought these little quotes. I thought they were helpful. This is from the biography of Camus by Herbert Lotman, but just to give you a sense about the upbringing, what his conditions of life were. The apartment was composed of 3 rooms and a kitchen. One of these rooms, which served as a dining room, was also a bedroom for his 2 uncles. He had a small balcony which faced a main road in the poor working class, the white working class area of Algiers before the revolution and the liberation. His mother had a room of her own. His grandmother had a room of her own. His mother shared the 3rd room with her children, Albert, Lucien, sleeping in a single bed. The apartment was 1 flight up, the top floor of a house in the Belcourt district of Algiers. There were 2 other apartments on the floor, a toilet in the hall serving all 3 apartments. There was no bathroom. The ground floor was occupied by a wine shop, later a restaurant. Before 1930, when he moved out, there was no running water or electricity. An oil lamp above the table could be raised or lowered. They called it simply the suspension. The other room had table lamps. There were no books. Right? He writes in one of his earliest essays. I just want to give you I try to give you a little sense of the person. In his earliest essays, that was called, it's usually translated the right side and the wrong side. I translate it as 2 sides of the coin, so I think that sort of captures it a little better. But there are a series of little essays, and one of them just really talks about, impersonally, about his returning home. But he said, "And I am home again. I think of a child living in a poor district. That neighborhood, that house, there were only 2 floors, and the stairs were unlit. Even now, long years later, he's reflecting having gone back, he could go back there on the darkest night. He knows that he could climb the stairs without stumbling once. His very body is impregnated with this house. His legs retain the exact height of the steps. His hand, the instinctive, never-conquered awe of the banister because of the cockroaches. So, I won't go on more about, but he obviously does not come from a family that was well endowed. His mother could never read. His grandmother could not read. He would go to the movies. He would have to interpret for them what was going on because they couldn't read. They couldn't read the words, etc. Okay. He was one of only 2 people from his elementary school that got into his high school. He only got into his high school because his grade school teacher, Louis Germain, to whom he dedicated his Nobel Prize address many years later, went out of his way to go to a home to try and convince his grandmother that he was worthy of going, that it was important that his education should continue, and that he should go to the high school and not just have to go out of work to feed the family. He was initiated into class society as one of only 2 students from a school to be accepted into the lycée situated on the other side of town. The resulting embarrassment felt that the poverty of his home life was doubly painful, as it marked both his difference from his classmates and the social world he sought to enter, and the subliminal sense of guilt of betraying his family. He remained ever torn by the conflicting pressures of social acceptance and personal inauthenticity. Never comfortable in the refined cultural world of Paris, even after obtaining public acclaim, he tended increasingly to romanticize his lower-class origins. But there was always an underlying sense of guilt. He wanted public acceptance, and he felt guilty continually, right, that by so doing he was in some sense denying and rejecting the family from which he came, and for which was so important. To this emerging class sensitivity was soon added an anguished awareness of human finitude, poignantly brought home by contracting tuberculosis and facing death at the age of 17. This was well before streptomycin. There was no treatment for tuberculosis. Many famous writers died of tuberculosis young. Keats is another example that comes immediately to mind. Many others, you can list them. Right? It was a very deadly disease. There was no treatment. Camus spent his life going into retreat, having to go up to the mountains, breathe clean air, the kind of stuff that Thomas Mann writes about, trying to maintain his health, having his lungs cleansed out, collapsed lung therapy, etc. And they were deeply scarred, and it's not clear how long he would have lived in any case. And that bears relevance to his writings, as I'll say in a moment, about the plague particularly. His early essay on the hospital in a poor neighborhood powerfully witnesses this depressing youthful encounter with mortality. A very personal urgency thus vitalized his metaphysical reflections, marking his mature work with a dual awareness of the sensuality of the body in direct contact with a vibrant nature, the reality of his daily life. He loved the swimming and was deeply involved in the physical life of Algerian youth. And has said many years later that if it wasn't for his bad health, he would have chosen soccer over writing. He was a goalie, and the only way we know when he first came down with tuberculosis is when his name disappears from the newspapers as a goalie in the local Algerian soccer team. Confronting the inevitability of aging and death in a stark landscape without illusions, this poignant encounter with the 2 sides of the coin, of vitality and death, finding transcribed expression in his early writings, yields an early injunction to live as if life had a meaning. So the sense of finitude deeply marked his character and personality from early on, as it sort of emerged into and burst into a life of natural enjoyment and physical exuberance. But at the same time, Camus was actively involved in concerns for human rights and human justice, and his entire life was marked by such activities. And it begins early on in the mid-30s. He was born on the 7th of November in 1913 comes down with tuberculosis in December of 1930. Right? Has to miss a year of his education while he's recuperating, finishes and gets his diplôme d'études supérieures in 1932 or 33. But because of his illness, he can never teach in French universities. And in fact, because of his illness, he could not join the military when the war started. That becomes another story, and maybe that's a benefit. So often there are these strange relationships between the negative and positive events. Perhaps had he been a teacher, he would never have been a writer, and perhaps had he not had tuberculosis, he might have been a teacher. Who knows, right? Life has its strange ways of transforming our experiences. But at the same time, in the mid-30s, he joined the Communist Party in 1935. And organized and was a leader of a workers' theater, which was an effort in collective creation among the working class people of Algiers to present theater to the populace, but to do it in a way which ennobled and enlightened and dignified their experiences. And in fact, he even engaged with his co-workers in producing a play which was subtitled An Essay in Collective Creation. And it was a play about the revolt of the mine workers in Asturias in Spain leading up to the Spanish Civil War, to which he always had an abiding, passionate commitment and support to the Republican cause throughout his entire life. That struggle with that workers' theater and his role as a leader in the intellectual uplifting, as it were, of the working people of both Arab and French in Algeria came to a close in 1937 when he was expelled from the Communist Party because he would refuse to go along with the change in their political line when they decided to support the French Popular Front in 1936. They then said, no longer should we criticize the French colonial administration in Algeria for the way they treat the Muslim majority. Camus would not go along with that, what he felt was a sellout of the Muslim majority to which he was totally committed, and he was expelled from the Communist Party. He then created his own independent working class theater. He was also a writer for Alger Républicain, which was sort of a left-wing publication seeking to defend the oppressed and to reveal the nature of the suffering of the people of the backcountry. That led to the suppression of that newspaper, and ultimately he couldn't get a job in Algiers and was forced to go to the mainland France to try and get a job. And then, of course, the war broke out. He returned back to Algiers, but his health was such that shortly thereafter he needed to get away from the climate of Algiers and get up to the mountains of central France, where he could be both treated and have the so-called clear air, which would help purify the lungs. It was in that context where he was in central France at the time that the Nazis invaded and took over southern France. The Vichy government closed the borders, and he was in fact cut off then from his family and his capacity to return. And he was living in central France, in the highlands of central France, then for the remainder of the war. All right. That's an interesting sidelight. If many of you may remember the experience of René Silver, who used to be a member here and who was one of those children in Chambon-sur-Lignon, who had been taken away from their parents and protected from the Nazis by the French Huguenot families that lived in that town in central France. Camus was living in the very same town, but there's no sense that he never knew of the effort of the Huguenot families to protect these children. Right? It was kept as such a secret. So he lived in the same town. That's where he was being treated for his health, his tuberculosis. At the same time, there were 2,000 young kids and houses there. René Silva being one of them. She didn't know, of course, what had happened until she saw the movie in 1990, "Lest Innocent Blood Be Shed," right, which revealed her name at the bottom of the screen to see, that's what happened and why she was in southern France and taken away from her family. Strange complication. But while he was in southern France, cut off from his family, and that whole experience reverberates through the plague. So if you read his novel, The Plague, you can, that experience of isolation, of being cut off and being in a foreign country and being isolated from your parents and your family and your community, is partially an expression of his own experience. But in the process, he got involved with the French resistance, the underground resistance. He ultimately became the editor of one of the leading French underground newspapers, Combat, the subtitle of which was From Resistance to Revolution. And when the French underground comes forth with the liberation of Paris and then the liberation of France, that's when he becomes a public celebrity. Right? In part because of his leading role as the editor of Combat, and because during the war he also published The Myth of Sisyphus and The Stranger, to which we'll come back in a moment. Right. So what I'm trying to give you a sense is of someone, both in terms of his personal character, his upbringing, his sense of really not being part of the intellectual establishment and yet wanting to be part of it, and yet struggling, as it were, with the sense of the guilt by which he is somehow losing or cutting off or not showing adequate respect for the family from which he came. There's a great book written in America, by the way, which really details similar kinds of experiences among white working class ethnic youth in Boston. I highly recommend that book by Richard Sennett and Jonathan Cobb. Which is just a brilliant book. It's called Hidden Injuries of Class. It's a brilliant, brilliant book. And it wasn't planned upon in my talk, it just occurs, but it's a brilliant book discussing the struggle between the different generations and the immigrant families and what it means to become accepted in the mainstream community, and then what is the price that family pays for their own identification with their heritage and culture. And that was really a problem for Camus personally. So his involvement then with the underground resistance, and the sense of the killings that are involved, led him initially to support the purge of those collaborators in France who collaborated with the Nazis before and during the war, and which led to their execution. But he became so outraged and offended by the way in which that purge was used to settle old scores, and in which the lower level people were put to death and the high ranking people were getting off, that he, within a short period of time, rethought, as it were, his commitment to the purge, felt that he was wrong, and that led him to write a series of articles, again relevant to our concerns here at the Ethical Society. One, Neither Victims Nor Executioners, which is a series of an analysis he wrote in 1946. Ultimately led him to write a brilliant essay called Reflections on the Guillotine, his critique of capital punishment, which comes many years later, and is really one of the most, I think, compelling arguments against capital punishment that has been written, well worth our thinking about and reflecting upon in the context of our concerns. I don't see Muriel here, but her passionate commitment to the opposition to the death penalty. So Camus then struggled throughout the late 40s into the 50s with how does one maintain a sense of human values and human dignity and develop a politics consistent of that, right, without getting caught up with the oppressions both of the left and the right. And he found himself increasingly in a no man's land as the Cold War emerges. I won't go into the details of that, but that led ultimately to his break with Jean-Paul Sartre, and it really came in a response to his book, The Rebel, which is a critique of ideologies of the effort, primarily at that point, of the way in which the communist movement was, he thought, a significant force of ideological oppression. There's also critiques of the right, but that was, for him at that point, less significant. But the struggle to find a third way, as it were, between these Cold War alternatives, to find a way that speaks for human rights, human dignity, some form of democracy and equality and non-oppression, became increasingly a no man's land in the 50s, and that got even worse when the Algerian Civil War breaks out in 1956. And so for the last 10 years of his life was, although even when he received the Nobel Prize in '57, it was a painfully agonizing experience for him. It was not a joyful one. I won't go again into the full details, but now I want to come back and I want to just say a little bit about that engagement that marks his life, which really was formulated and it finds expression in his writings, and that's for what he's most known. The writings, books such as The Myth of Sisyphus, The Stranger. Most everybody has gone to high school or college has probably read The Stranger at some time. But it's important to see that in the context of this commitment which is really a humanist commitment, a commitment to build a community of caring individuals, a series of communities, right? And he says, one of my favorite little talks, he says, the statements of his, he says, human beings only emancipate themselves in the midst of natural groups, right? From the smallest level on up. Right? And the necessity of trying to articulate the values and the processes by which one can chart out a meaningful life in a world without transcendent significance is the overriding theme of his life. And he formulates this really remarkably early on as a life's project to create a series of works built around these themes. And he envisages it from early on that he will have a theme on the absurd. And every one of these series, as it were, will have a play, a novel, and a philosophical essay. All right? The first series would be the absurd, which deals with what is our metaphysical condition in this world. You read the ethical statement initial about this, our only life. All right? In a world, what is the absurd? The absurd, but for Camus, doesn't mean our life is absurd. What it means is that we want our life to have an ultimate meaning, and we find ourselves in a world which is deaf to that need, deaf to that desire. And the world is not absurd itself. The world just is. But it doesn't, give a whit for us. But we want it to have some more transcendent significance. Right? In fact, the entire history, as it were, you can say the written history, as it were, of Western civilization, just speak of that, for example, is marked primarily by the religious traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. All of those are monotheistic religions, more or less, right, which seek to give an ultimate meaning and significance to human existence. And Camus' dissertation was a study of early Christianity and Neoplatonism, which, by the way, comes from North Africa. St. Augustine, he writes about. Plotinus, he writes about. That's Neoplatonism, and both of those were North Africans. So there was a tremendous identification with the experiential roots of Augustinian philosophy and Plotinian philosophy, and of the Christian tradition which comes out of St. Augustine, which is really the central aspect of certainly of Catholicism and of Protestantism. It is both Augustine and Luther who both go back to Paul's letter to the Romans as the source of their religious conversion, as it were. So that again, that's another story. But that need that we are and the desire confronting a world which doesn't respond to it is the metaphysical framework within which, when we then want to struggle, what is the possibility? Remember, the myth of Sisyphus begins with the question, is suicide justified? The effort is to find a framework in which life can have a meaning on its own terms. And the myth of Sisyphus has as its epigram at the beginning, "O my soul, do not aspire to immortal life, but exhaust the field of the possible." And that's the philosophical framework. So in the theme in the series, as it were, the first series, what he calls it, of his work, is the series of the absurd. There is a novel, The Stranger. There is a play, Caligula. And there is a theoretical statement, The Myth of Sisyphus. Right? Then the second stage is the stage of revolt. Right? Rebellion, revolt has two meanings. It has a metaphysical one against the meaninglessness of life and the affirmation of its potential significance, and then against the myriad ways in which human beings seek to oppress individuals and therefore impede the capacity of individuals and communities to find and give meaning to their lives. And that stage also has a play, The State of Siege, also The Just Assassins. There are two plays, actually, for reasons which we won't go into here. A novel, The Plague, and the philosophical essay, The Rebel. At that point, the future Camus envisages further stages in the development of his thought. Those stages cannot be easily articulated. His life didn't fulfill that chance. He talks about stages of community. He talks about the problems of building community and about judgment and about love. They don't really form. We can talk about the writings that he engages in: The Fall, Exile in the Kingdom. And if you think about the titles of Camus' work, they are all mythic titles. The Stranger, The Fall, The Plague, Exile in the Kingdom, right? The Rebel. I mean, these are mythic titles which I think articulate and express fundamental themes of our collective Western experience. Right? And it is, and he said he's not really interested particularly in psychological studies. He's really interested in his writings in the dramatization of fundamental themes of human existence. Now, in closing, as Judy is showing me that I should be bringing this to an end, let me just list a couple of the key issues that he struggles to articulate how they relate. All right? I mean, Camus has been often called a pacifist. He's not a pacifist, but he certainly does not wish to will not justify legitimate murder, whether by individuals or by states. So tries to then articulate a way of understanding how self-defense is not only possible but occasionally necessary, and at the same time to limit that within the context of the community which we're all a part. And the fundamental theme of Camus is that we're in this together. Right? As a species, we must find our way to working that out in a cooperative and collective fashion. Right? That sometimes does mean, though, one must engage in militant action, as he did during the war, and he never rejected the work of the resistance. Also, in that process of developing it, one must find a way to merge two tensions, the tensions between justice and freedom. One needs to appreciate the capacity for individuals to be dignified and self-respectful. They must be able to be free and liberated, but they must do that in terms of communities, and communities must provide the kinds of opportunities and supports which make that freedom, to give that freedom substance. Right? So the tension it's not an opposition and a conflict in one, and the negative aspects of our experience when one chooses one at the expense of the other is finding how to merge justice and freedom, how to merge respect for human dignity with the necessity of fighting sometimes and defending it. Right? And that means that rebellion and revolution, which are often counterposed, right, must also be seen as inextricably linked together. Revolution is the institutional transformation of a situation so as to empower human beings. Right? Rebellion is the articulation and defense of human rights and human dignity, and the insistence on that. Right? And the challenge is to find the ways to maintain and merge those two together, not losing one at the expense of the other. Again, without going into great detail. Let me then conclude, since time is short, and I am aware of that, and I will conclude with a little quote, with a little start I wrote in an article I wrote many years ago. Almost alone among traditional intellectuals, Camus remained tied by sensitivity and vision to his working class origins. His values drew more from the communal experience of college soccer than from the theoretical speculations of our greatest writers. The egalitarian collective effort of the workers' theater, where stars did not take bows after performances and everyone pitched in with the staging, suggested to him the outlines of a truly just society. Similarly, he sought to share the collective tasks of journalism as editor of Combat, while treating the production crew with the respect and responsibility appropriate to its contribution and dignity. Hierarchy was no longer to be a matter of status and deference, but a function and quality of performance. And decisions were to be made by the involved collective, respecting the dignity and legitimate interests of all participants. While not despising the arts of high culture, though always quite uncomfortable with their mores, the Renaissance, which is what he was always speaking of, not the Renaissance for him, which was a rebirth in the quality of life of the average person, always meant for Camus the qualitative transformation of daily life, the creation of dialogic communities at work and at home that gave voice and sustenance to the struggles for dignity of ordinary people. He continued to believe that only when the dignity of the worker and the respect for intelligence are accorded their rightful place can human existence hope to realize its highest ideals, and our life find the collective meaning and purpose that alone can truly sustain us in the face of an infinite and different universe. Thank you.